The sound of a piano had always been Owen Mitchell's secret language. Not the kind of secret you whisper about with friends, but the kind you bury deep because you know the world won't understand. He was 7 years old when his grandmother first sat him down at her old upright piano, the one with the chipped keys and the slightly out-of-tune middle C. She placed his small hands on the keys and said something he would never forget. "This is where you'll find yourself when everything else gets too loud." Back then, he didn't understand what she meant. He was just a kid who liked the way the keys felt under his fingers, the way pressing them created sounds that seemed to come from somewhere magical. His grandmother gave him lessons every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, and those 2 hours became the highlight of his week. She taught him scales and simple songs, but more importantly, she taught him to feel the music, not just play it. Everything changed when his grandmother passed away during the winter of his 8th year. The funeral was quiet, and his family didn't talk much about their grief. His father, a man who worked 60-hour weeks at the manufacturing plant on the edge of town, inherited the piano. Owen expected him to sell it. Most things in their house had a practical purpose, and a piano didn't exactly fit that category. But one Saturday morning, his father and uncle loaded it into a truck and brought it to their basement. "Your grandmother would have wanted you to have it," his father said, not quite making eye contact. "But we need to be clear about something. This is fine for now, as a hobby. But don't go getting any big ideas about it. Life isn't a movie, son. You need something solid to build on." Owen nodded, understanding even at 8 years old that this was both a gift and a warning. In their neighborhood, success meant a steady job, a reliable truck, and maybe coaching Little League on weekends. The arts were something that happened on TV, in distant cities where people wore suits they couldn't afford and lived lives that seemed disconnected from reality. His father wasn't being cruel. He was being practical, preparing his son for a world where dreams needed to be tempered with realism. So the piano became Owen's secret. He played it in the basement after school, after finishing his homework and his chores. His mother would sometimes pause at the top of the basement stairs, listening, but she never said much about it. His father pretended not to notice, though Owen sometimes caught him standing by the basement door with an expression that was hard to read. At school, Owen learned to be invisible. He wasn't unpopular, but he wasn't particularly social either. He sat in the middle rows, got decent grades, and played right field in baseball because someone had to. The other kids talked about video games and sports, and Owen joined in enough to blend. Nobody asked what he did after school, and he never volunteered the information. There was an unspoken understanding in his world. Boys didn't play piano. That was something for the kids whose parents drove fancy cars and talked about college like it was inevitable. By the time Owen reached high school, his skill had grown far beyond those first simple songs his grandmother taught him. He practiced for hours, losing himself in classical pieces by composers whose names his friends wouldn't recognize: Chopin, Debussy, Rachmaninoff. He started composing his own music, too, melodies that poured out of him during the quiet hours when the house slept. His hands had changed from those early days. They were broader now, stronger, marked with calluses from his part-time job at his uncle's auto repair shop where he worked weekends and summers. The auto shop was another part of his cover story. When people asked what he did with his time, he talked about cars and engines, about the satisfaction of fixing something broken. It wasn't entirely a lie. He did find some satisfaction in that work, in the straightforward problem-solving of mechanical repair. But it wasn't the same as sitting at the piano, wasn't the same as feeling a piece of music build and flow through him like water finding its path. His uncle once caught him tapping out a rhythm on the workbench, fingers moving in patterns that had nothing to do with wrenches or oil changes. "You okay, kid?" his uncle asked, and Owen quickly nodded, grabbing a tool and getting back to work. These moments happened more often as he got older. The music was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting for any chance to break through. There was one person who knew the full extent of his talent. Mrs. Rodriguez taught music at the community college, and Owen had started taking lessons with her when he was 15. He paid for the lessons himself with money from the shop, telling his parents it was for extra tutoring in math. Mrs. Rodriguez saw something in him that first day, when he sat down and played a Chopin nocturne with such feeling that she had to pause before speaking. "You have a gift," she told him. "A real gift. What are you going to do with it?" Owen shrugged, uncomfortable with the direct question. "I don't know. Just play, I guess. It's not really something I can do anything with." She looked at him with an expression that mixed sadness and frustration. "Says who?" "Everyone," Owen replied. And it was true. The world he lived in had made it very clear what paths were acceptable and which ones were fantasy. Music was fine as a hobby, something to impress people at parties maybe, but it wasn't a life. It wasn't real. But Mrs. Rodriguez didn't push. She just continued teaching him, expanding his repertoire, introducing him to jazz and contemporary pieces alongside the classical music he loved. She gave him a key to the practice room so he could come play whenever he wanted, and he often stayed until the building closed, his fingers moving across keys while the rest of the world moved on without him. The truth was, Owen had learned to live in two worlds. There was the world everyone saw, where he was just another young guy working his way through life, focused on practical things and realistic goals. And then there was the world he inhabited in the basement, in the practice room, in the private spaces where he could finally breathe and be exactly who he was meant to be. He had become an expert at keeping these worlds separate, at making sure they never collided. He never imagined that one day they would crash together in front of hundreds of people, changing everything he thought he knew about himself and what was possible. But that moment was still years away, hidden in a future he couldn't yet see. For now, he was just a young man with calloused hands and a secret that grew heavier with each passing year, wondering if the music inside him would ever find its way into the light. 5 years after high school, Owen found himself sitting in a gray cubicle on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, staring at spreadsheets that all looked the same. He had a business degree from the state university, a student loan payment that arrived like clockwork every month, and a job title that sounded impressive when he said it at family gatherings: financial analyst at Bridgeport Solutions. His father had been proud the day Owen got the job offer. "See, I told you. Stick with something practical, and good things happen." His mother had cried happy tears and immediately started telling the neighbors. Even his uncle at the auto shop had clapped him on the back and said he always knew Owen was too smart to spend his life under the hood of cars. Nobody mentioned the piano anymore. It sat in Owen's small apartment, a one-bedroom place he could barely afford even with his decent salary. The piano had been expensive to move, and his father had questioned the decision. "You sure you need to bring that thing? Takes up a lot of space." But Owen had insisted, telling himself he'd play on weekends, that he'd keep the music alive even while building his career. That was 18 months ago. These days, the piano was mostly a place where he piled mail and dry cleaning. He told himself he was just tired, that once he got settled into the rhythm of corporate life, he'd find time. But the truth was harder to admit. Every time he sat down to play, he felt the weight of everything else pressing down on him. The quarterly reports waiting to be finished, the presentation he needed to prepare for Tuesday, the emails that never stopped coming, even at 10 o'clock at night. Work consumed him in ways he hadn't expected. His colleagues were friendly enough, though most conversations stayed surface level. They talked about weekend plans and sports scores and which restaurants had good happy hour deals. Owen joined them sometimes, sitting in sports bars and pretending to care about games while his mind wandered to chord progressions and melodies he'd never have time to develop. He was good at his job. That was the strange part. He understood the numbers, could spot patterns in data that others missed, and his reports were always thorough and on time. His supervisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Hayes, had already hinted at a promotion if he kept up his performance. "You've got potential, Mitchell," she told him during his last review. "Keep your head down, stay focused, and you'll go far here." Keep your head down, stay focused. These phrases had become the soundtrack of his life, replacing the music that used to fill his days. He was good at following instructions, good at being what people expected him to be. It's what he'd been practicing his whole life. One afternoon, Owen was eating lunch alone in the break room when his coworker Daniel sat down across from him. Daniel was one of those people who seemed to know everyone's business without really trying. He was friendly in a way that felt genuine, always asking questions that showed he actually listened to the answers. "So, what do you do for fun?" Daniel asked between bites of his sandwich. "You never really talk about yourself much." Owen shrugged. "Not much, honestly. Work keeps me pretty busy." "Come on, everybody does something. Sports? Gaming? Got a girlfriend?" "I used to play piano," Owen said, surprising himself. He hadn't planned to say it. The words just came out, maybe because he was tired, or maybe because it had been so long since anyone had asked him about anything real. Daniel's eyebrows went up. "No kidding? Like, really play or just mess around?" "Really play. Classical stuff, mostly. Some jazz. I write my own music sometimes, or I used to." Owen felt exposed, like he'd revealed something he should have kept hidden. "It's just a hobby, though. Nothing serious." "That's actually pretty cool," Daniel said. "You should play something at the holiday party next month. There's a piano in the main conference room. I bet people would love it." Owen felt his stomach tighten. "Nah, I don't really perform or anything. Like I said, it's just a hobby. Haven't even played much lately." "Your loss, man. Would be better than watching Johnson do his drunk karaoke routine for the third year in a row." Daniel laughed and changed the subject, but Owen noticed him glancing over a few times with what looked like curiosity. 2 days later, Patricia called Owen into her office. He assumed it was about the Anderson account, maybe a question about the projections he'd submitted. Instead, she gestured for him to close the door and sit down. "Daniel mentioned you play piano," she said, getting straight to the point like she always did. Owen's chest tightened. "It's not really a big deal, just something I did when I was younger." Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Here's the thing, Mitchell. You're doing good work here. Really good work. But I need you to understand something about how this place operates. We're building a team of serious professionals. People who are committed, focused, not distracted by side projects or hobbies that might pull their attention away from what matters." "I am focused," Owen said quickly. Your work is fine. That's not what I'm worried about." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Look, I'm not saying you can't have hobbies, but there's a certain image we need to maintain here. When clients and partners see our analysts, they need to see people they can trust with serious money and serious decisions. Not artists, not dreamers. You understand what I'm saying?" Owen understood perfectly. It was the same message he'd been getting his entire life, just dressed up in professional language. Don't be different. Don't stand out. Don't let people see the parts of you that don't fit the mold. "I understand," he said quietly. "Good." Patricia's expression softened slightly. "This is about protecting your career, Owen. You've got a bright future here if you play your cards right. Don't let anything jeopardize that. Keep the piano stuff to yourself. Enjoy it on your own time. But it's not something that needs to be part of your professional identity. Fair enough?" Owen nodded and left her office feeling like he'd been punched in the gut. The message was clear. His music wasn't just unimportant, it was a liability. Something that made him less credible, less professional, less worthy of being taken seriously. That evening, he went home to his quiet apartment and stood in front of the piano. He moved the pile of mail, the dry cleaning bags, the stack of folders he'd brought home from work. He sat down and placed his hands on the keys, but they felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else. He tried to play something, anything, but every note felt forced, mechanical, empty. After 10 minutes, he gave up. He covered the piano with a sheet, telling himself it was to protect it from dust, but really, he just couldn't stand looking at it anymore. It had become a reminder of everything he'd given up, every compromise he'd made, every time he'd chosen safety over passion. Owen returned to his laptop and opened his work email. 37 new messages since he'd left the office 2 hours ago. He started reading through them, responding, organizing, doing what was expected of him, being the person everyone needed him to be. The piano stayed covered for the next 8 months, a ghost in the corner of his living room, silent and forgotten. Owen threw himself deeper into work, accepting every extra project, staying late, coming in early. If he was going to give up the music, he'd at least make the sacrifice worth something. He'd be successful. He'd prove that his father was right, that practical choices led to a good life. But late at night, when the apartment was completely quiet and the city noise faded to a distant hum, Owen sometimes woke up with melodies running through his head, songs he'd never written, compositions that would never exist beyond those fleeting moments of half-sleep. He'd lie there in the dark, listening to music only he could hear, wondering if this was how it would always be. The email came on a Wednesday afternoon, marked urgent with a red exclamation point. Owen almost deleted it, thinking it was spam, but the subject line caught his attention. Annual Charity Gala, all hands required. Bridgeport Solutions hosted a charity gala every year, a black tie event that raised money for local children's hospitals. It was the company's biggest night, where executives rubbed shoulders with potential clients, investors, and local politicians. Owen had attended last year as a new employee, spending most of the evening standing awkwardly by the appetizer table while everyone else networked. This year's event was 3 weeks away, and according to the email, attendance wasn't optional. Patricia had made it clear in a follow-up message to their team. Everyone needed to be there, looking professional, representing the company well. Owen added it to his calendar with a sense of resignation. Another evening of forced small talk and uncomfortable dress shoes. He didn't think about the gala again until the following Monday, when the office erupted into chaos. Owen was walking past the event planning office when he heard raised voices. The door was partially open, and he could see Karen, the event coordinator, pacing back and forth with her phone pressed to her ear. "What do you mean you're canceling? The event is in 10 days. Her voice was strained, almost panicked. "We sent the deposit 6 months ago. We have 300 confirmed guests. We've already printed programs with your name on them." Owen kept walking, not wanting to intrude, but the whole office buzzed with the news by lunchtime. The pianist they'd hired for the gala had canceled. Something about a family emergency in another state. Karen had been calling every musician, every agency, every contact she had, but everyone was either booked or asking for triple the original fee with such short notice. "It's a disaster," Daniel whispered to Owen at their desks. "Hayes is furious. Apparently, the whole program was built around having live music during dinner. Now they're talking about just playing Spotify through the speakers like it's a high school dance." Owen felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he'd been suppressing for months. He could do it. He could play for the gala. The thought came unbidden, and he immediately tried to push it away. That was insane. He hadn't seriously played in almost a year. His fingers would be rusty. Besides, Patricia had made it clear what she thought about his music. But the thought wouldn't leave him alone. All afternoon, as he tried to focus on quarterly projections, he kept imagining himself at a piano, playing for a room full of people. The fear and the longing twisted together in his stomach until he couldn't tell them apart. At 4:30, Patricia appeared at his cubicle. She looked exhausted. and there was something in her expression he'd never seen before. Desperation. "Mitchell, can you come to my office, please?" Owen followed her, his heart pounding. Had he done something wrong? Was this about the gala? She closed the door behind them and sat down heavily in her chair. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She rubbed her temples like she had a headache. "That piano thing Daniel mentioned months ago, can you actually play? Like really play, not just chopsticks at a Christmas party?" Owen's mouth went dry. "Yes, I can really play." "How good are we talking?" "I'm good," Owen said quietly. "I studied for years, classical training, jazz, composition. I can sight read pretty much anything." Patricia stared at him for a long moment, and he couldn't read her expression. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "You told me not to. You said it wasn't professional, that I should keep it to myself." She winced slightly. "Right, I did say that." She was quiet for another moment, then leaned forward. "Here's the situation. We're in a bind, a serious bind. This gala is a big deal for the company, and we have no entertainment. The whole evening is going to fall flat, and we've got some major potential clients attending who we're trying to impress." Owen waited, knowing what was coming but not quite believing it. "I need you to play at the gala," Patricia said finally. 2 hours, maybe 3. Background music during dinner, something a bit more upbeat during the networking portion. Can you do that?" Every instinct told Owen to say no, to protect himself, to stay safe, to keep being the person who fit in and didn't cause waves. But something else was rising up in him, something that had been buried for too long. "I can do it," he heard himself say. Patricia's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you. Seriously, you're saving us here." Then her expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "But I need you to understand something. This is a business solution to a business problem. I don't want you going around the office telling everyone you're some kind of concert pianist. If people ask, you're just helping out in a pinch." The words stung, but they didn't surprise him. "What about at the event? The programs with the previous performer's name? We'll put a small note in saying there's been a change of entertainment. We won't make a big deal out of it." She paused, and her voice became firmer. "And Mitchell, if this doesn't go well, if it's embarrassing or unprofessional, we'll just say you were filling time until we could find a real solution. Understood?" Owen understood perfectly. He was being given a chance, but it came with an escape clause. If he failed, he'd be dismissed as an amateur who got in over his head. The company would distance itself, and he'd be remembered as the analyst who couldn't stay in his lane. "I understand," he said. That evening, Owen went home and stood in front of the covered piano. His hands were shaking as he pulled off the sheet. Dust had settled on the keys despite the covering. He sat down slowly, like he was approaching something fragile that might break. He pressed a single key. The note rang out in the silent apartment, clear and true, and something inside Owen's chest cracked open. He played a scale, then a simple melody. His fingers were stiff at first, uncertain, but muscle memory began to take over. Within minutes, he was playing a Chopin nocturne, and it was like coming home after being lost for a very long time. The next 10 days became a blur of double life. During work hours, Owen was the same quiet analyst he'd always been, keeping his head down, doing his job. But the moment he got home, he transformed. He practiced for hours every night, until his neighbors knocked on the wall telling him to stop. His fingers, soft from months of only typing, developed new calluses. His back ached from sitting at the piano bench. But he felt more alive than he had in years. He pulled out pieces he hadn't played since college, Gershwin for the upbeat portions, some Bill Evans for atmosphere. He even dusted off a few of his own compositions, pieces he'd written years ago and never thought anyone would hear. Sometimes, in the middle of practicing, fear would hit him like a wave. What was he doing? 300 people would be watching. His colleagues, his bosses, important clients. What if he froze? What if his hands shook so badly he couldn't play? What if Patricia was right to be cautious and this whole thing ended in disaster? But then he'd think about the alternative. Going back to pretending the music didn't exist. Covering the piano again. Spending the rest of his life wondering what might have happened if he'd been brave enough to try. On the night before the gala, Owen couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through every piece he planned to play, every transition, every possible thing that could go wrong. At 2 a.m, he got up and played through his entire program one more time, his fingers moving across the keys in the dark apartment. Tomorrow night, everything would change. He just didn't know yet whether it would change for better or worse. All he knew was that for the first time in years, he was about to let people see who he really was, and that terrified him more than anything he'd ever done. The Grand Riverside Hotel ballroom was even more intimidating than Owen had imagined. Crystal chandeliers hung from 20-foot ceilings, casting warm light over tables draped in white linen. Everything gleamed, the silverware, the wine glasses, the polished marble floor. And there, on a raised platform near the center of the room, sat a concert grand piano that probably cost more than Owen's car. He arrived 2 hours early, wearing the suit he'd bought specifically for this night. His hands wouldn't stop shaking as he walked across the empty ballroom toward the piano. The hotel events manager, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, gave him a brief nod. "You're the replacement?" he asked, looking Owen up and down with barely concealed skepticism. "Yes. Sound check is in 15 minutes. Don't touch anything until the audio team gets here." The man walked away before Owen could respond. Owen sat down at the piano bench and stared at the keys. They were perfect, pristine, probably tuned that very morning. He wanted to play something, to warm up, but his hands were trembling too badly. What had he been thinking? This wasn't some basement practice session or a college recital. This was 300 people, many of whom he'd see at work on Monday morning. The sound check went poorly. His fingers felt clumsy, and he kept hitting wrong notes. The audio technician kept asking him to play louder, then softer, then adjust his position. By the time they finished, Owen's shirt was damp with sweat under his jacket. "You good?" the technician asked, packing up his equipment. Owen nodded, not trusting his voice. Guests started arriving at 6:30. Owen watched from behind a curtain as the ballroom filled with people in tuxedos and evening gowns. He recognized faces from the office, from client meetings, from company emails. Patricia arrived with the CEO, both of them laughing at something, looking relaxed and confident. Daniel showed up with a date, a woman in a red dress who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. At 7 o'clock sharp, Karen appeared beside him, holding a clipboard and looking stressed. "You're on in 5 minutes. Start with something quiet, sophisticated, nothing too flashy. You'll play through dinner service, that's about 90 minutes, then take a break while speeches happen. Got it?" "Got it," Owen managed to say. "Ann Mitchell?" She lowered her voice. "Please don't make me regret this." She walked away, and Owen was alone with his panic. His chest felt tight, like he couldn't get enough air. 4 minutes, 3 minutes, he could still back out. He could say he was sick, that he couldn't do it. They could just play recorded music. It would be fine. But then he thought about the piano in his apartment, covered with a sheet for 8 months. He thought about his grandmother's hands guiding his fingers across the keys when he was 7. He thought about every time he'd made himself smaller, quieter, less than what he was, just to fit into someone else's idea of who he should be. 2 minutes. Owen walked to the piano, his legs feeling like they might give out. A few people glanced his way, but most were engaged in conversation, holding drinks, not really paying attention. He sat down at the bench and placed his hands on the keys. They were cool and smooth under his fingers. This was it. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Then he began to play. The piece was one he'd written himself years ago, during his last year of college. It was called Quiet Spaces, though he'd never told anyone the title. It started soft and melancholy, a simple melody that spoke of longing and things left unsaid. His fingers found their way across the keys like they were remembering a language they'd almost forgotten. Something strange happened as he played. The shaking stopped. The fear didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else, something that fed the music instead of choking it. He opened his eyes and let his fingers move faster, adding complexity to the melody, building layers of sound that filled the enormous room. The conversations around him didn't stop immediately. People were still talking, still laughing, still focused on their drinks and their networking. But gradually, Owen noticed something changing. Voices got a little quieter. Heads turned slightly in his direction. Someone at a nearby table put down their fork and just listened. Owen moved from his own composition into a jazz standard, Autumn Leaves, but he played it his way, with unexpected chord changes and a tempo that ebbed and flowed like water. His fingers were flying now, completely free, doing things he didn't even consciously think about. This was what his grandmother had meant all those years ago. This was where he found himself when everything else got too loud. By the time he transitioned into Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, the entire ballroom had gone quiet. 300 people had stopped their conversations. Waiters froze mid-service. Even the bartenders had stopped pouring drinks. Everyone was listening. Owen felt it, the shift in the room's energy. It flowed back to him like a current, feeding the music, making it bigger and more powerful. He poured everything into the piano. Every disappointment, every compromise, every moment he'd hidden who he was, but also every joy, every moment of beauty he'd found in the music, every reason he'd kept playing even when no one was listening. He played pieces they'd know and pieces they wouldn't, classical and jazz and blues and everything in between. He played music that made people want to cry and music that made them want to dance. He played like his life depended on it, because in a way, it did. This wasn't just a performance. It was a declaration. This is who I am. This is what I can do. You can't unsee this. Somewhere in the middle of a Chopin piece, Owen realized he'd forgotten about everyone watching him. He was playing for himself now, for his grandmother, for the 7-year-old boy who'd first discovered magic in the sound of ivory keys. The ballroom could have been empty or filled with 1,000 people. It didn't matter anymore. Time stopped meaning anything. He had no idea if he'd been playing for 20 minutes or 2 hours. His fingers should have been tired, but they weren't. They felt strong, sure, exactly where they were meant to be. When he finally played the last note of his program, he let it ring out into the silence. The sound faded slowly, dissolving into the air of the ballroom. Owen sat there, his hands still on the keys, his heart pounding, suddenly aware again of where he was and what had just happened. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched out, and Owen felt a spike of panic. Had he made a terrible mistake? Had he been so lost in the music that he'd played badly and not even realized it? Then someone started clapping. Just one person at first, somewhere in the back of the room, then another person joined in, then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted in applause. But it wasn't regular applause. People were standing up, all of them. 300 people rising to their feet, clapping so hard their hands must have hurt. Owen looked out at the sea of faces and saw things he'd never expected to see. Tears, genuine smiles, looks of absolute astonishment. Patricia was standing at her table, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide. Daniel was clapping so enthusiastically he'd knocked over his water glass. Even the CEO, a man Owen had never seen show emotion, was on his feet applauding. The standing ovation went on and on. A full minute, 2 minutes. People were calling out bravo and incredible. Owen stood up from the piano bench, not quite sure what to do with himself, his face burning with a mixture of embarrassment and something he couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe, or relief, or the simple joy of being fully seen for the first time in his life. Karen rushed up to the platform, her clipboard forgotten, her professional composure completely gone. That was... I don't even... She was actually crying. Why didn't anyone tell me you could play like that? Owen didn't have an answer for her. How could he explain that until 10 days ago he'd been told to keep it quiet? That he'd spent years making himself invisible because people like Patricia had warned him that his talent was a liability. The applause finally died down, but people didn't return to their conversations. They came up to him, a steady stream of guests, each wanting to shake his hand, to tell him how moved they'd been, to ask where he'd studied and why they'd never heard him play before. Owen answered as best he could, still in a daze, still not quite believing what had just happened. His hands were shaking again, but for a completely different reason now. Everything had changed. He could feel it in the air, see it in people's eyes. He wasn't just Owen Mitchell, the quiet financial analyst anymore. He was Owen Mitchell, the pianist who'd left 300 people breathless. And there was no going back. Owen woke up the next morning to 73 text messages and 42 missed calls. His phone had been buzzing since 6 in the morning, but he'd been too exhausted to check it. The gala had gone until almost midnight, and he'd spent hours after his performance talking to people, shaking hands, accepting compliments that still didn't feel quite real. Now, sitting up in bed, he scrolled through the messages with growing disbelief. Most were from co-workers he barely knew, people he'd never exchanged more than a few words with in the break room. "Dude, you're famous. Have you seen the video? This is insane." Video? What video? Owen opened his social media apps and froze. There it was, on every platform. Multiple videos of his performance from different angles, some clearly shot on phones during the event. The most popular one, posted by someone he didn't even recognize, had already been viewed over 2 million times. The caption read, "Corporate analyst turns out to be a piano genius." This gave me chills. The comment section was overwhelming, thousands of people sharing their reactions, tagging friends, asking who he was and where they could hear more. Why isn't this guy famous? I literally got goosebumps. This is what real talent looks like. Someone had even created a hashtag. Find the pianist. Owen set down his phone, his hands shaking. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like him. But his phone kept buzzing with new notifications, new messages, new friend requests from strangers who wanted to know more about the mysterious pianist from the corporate event. By Monday morning, everything at work had shifted. Owen walked into the office and people actually stopped what they were doing to stare. Some smiled and waved, others whispered to their neighbors. Daniel practically ran across the floor to grab him. "Dude, you broke the internet. Do you know how many views you're up to now? Over 5 million. There are news outlets calling the company asking about you. This is crazy." Patricia called him into her office before lunch. Owen expected another lecture, maybe a warning about the distraction this was causing. Instead, she looked at him with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. Uncertainty. "Mitchell, I need to apologize to you," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "What I said before, about keeping your music quiet, about it not being professional. I was wrong. Completely wrong." Owen didn't know what to say. He'd prepared himself for every possible conversation except this one. "I've been getting calls all weekend," Patricia continued. "Reporters, talent agencies, event planners. Everyone wants to know about you. And I had to tell them I had no idea. The pianist who worked for me for 2 years, and I told him his greatest talent was something to hide." She shook her head. "That was stupid. And I'm sorry." "It's okay," Owen started to say, but she held up her hand. "No. It's not okay. I did what people have probably been doing to you your whole life. I put you in a box because it was easier, because it fit my idea of what you should be." She paused. "You have an incredible gift, Owen, and you should be sharing it with the world, not buried in spreadsheets on the 14th floor." Those words hung in the air between them. They both knew what she was really saying, what this conversation was really about. "I don't know what to do," Owen admitted. "This whole thing has been overwhelming. I mean, people are calling me, actually calling me to perform, to record, to teach. A talent agent left me 3 voicemails yesterday. But this job, it's stable, it's safe." "Is that what you want?" Patricia asked. "Safe?" Owen thought about the covered piano in his apartment. He thought about the years of keeping quiet, of making himself smaller, of choosing security over truth. He thought about standing at that piano 2 nights ago, finally letting the world see who he really was, and how alive he'd felt in that moment. "No," he said quietly. "It's not." The decision didn't happen all at once. Owen spent the next month working his regular job while his evenings filled with performances. Small venues at first, coffee shops and local events. But word spread fast. The videos kept circulating, each performance adding to his growing reputation. The talent agent, a sharp woman named Caroline who'd been in the music industry for 20 years, helped him navigate the sudden attention. "You've got something special," she told him over coffee one afternoon. "Real artistry combined with a story people connect with. The guy who hid his talent for years and finally broke free. That resonates with people because so many of them are hiding something too." That observation stuck with Owen. In the weeks following the gala, he'd received hundreds of messages from strangers. Not just people who liked his music, but people who told him their own stories. The lawyer who secretly wrote poetry, the accountant who painted in her garage, the engineer who dreamed of opening a bakery but never told anyone. All of them living split lives, keeping their passions hidden because someone, somewhere along the way, had told them it wasn't practical or professional or worth pursuing. 3 months after the gala, Owen submitted his resignation to Bridgeport Solutions. Patricia accepted it with a sad smile and a firm handshake. His co-workers threw him a going-away party, and this time he played for them willingly, joyfully, without any hesitation or shame. His father came to his first real concert, a sold-out show at a theater downtown. Owen had been nervous about that, unsure what his dad would say about him leaving the stable job to pursue music. But after the performance, his father found him backstage with tears in his eyes. "Your grandmother would have been so proud," he said, pulling Owen into a hug. "I'm sorry I made you think this wasn't enough. I was wrong. I was just scared for you, wanted you to have security. But watching you up there tonight..." He pulled back, shaking his head. "That's what life is supposed to look like. That's what it means to be fully alive." Owen's new life wasn't always easy. Some months were financially tight. Sometimes he doubted his decision, especially when he saw his former co-workers posting about bonuses and promotions. But then he'd sit down at the piano, or stand on stage in front of an audience, or wake up in the morning actually looking forward to the day ahead, and he'd remember why he'd made this choice. A year after the gala, Owen started teaching. Not just technique and theory, but something deeper. He taught his students that music wasn't just about hitting the right notes. It was about honesty, about having the courage to show the world who you really were. His studio became a space where people could be vulnerable, could explore the parts of themselves they'd learned to hide. One of his first students was a teenager named Jordan, a kid who reminded Owen of himself at that age. Jordan's parents wanted him to focus on academics, said music was a distraction. The first time Jordan sat at the piano in Owen's studio, his hands were stiff with anxiety, afraid to make mistakes, afraid to be seen. "Let me tell you something," Owen said, sitting beside him. "I spent years hiding what I could do because I was afraid. Afraid people wouldn't understand, afraid it wasn't practical, afraid of standing out. And you know what all that fear cost me? Time. Years of my life where I wasn't fully myself. He played a few notes, letting Jordan hear the emotion in even the simplest melody. When you play music, you're not just making sounds. You're telling the truth about what's inside you. And yeah, that's scary. Being seen is always scary. But hiding who you are? That's even scarier, because eventually, you forget. You forget what it feels like to be completely, authentically yourself. Jordan looked at him with understanding in his eyes, and Owen saw the moment something clicked. The boy's hands relaxed on the keys, and he began to play, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Owen thought about his grandmother often, especially in moments like these. She'd given him 2 gifts that day when he was 7 years old, the music itself, and the permission to find himself within it. For years, he'd forgotten the second gift, let other voices drown out her wisdom. But now he understood what she'd really been telling him. The world was loud and full of opinions about who people should be, what they should want, how they should spend their lives, but inside everyone was a quiet space where truth lived, where passion waited, where the real self existed beneath all the expectations and fears. Music was Owen's way of accessing that space. For others, it might be painting or writing or dancing or building things with their hands or any one of 1,000 different expressions of the human spirit. The tragedy wasn't just in hiding those gifts. The tragedy was in all the people who never got to experience them, never got to be moved or inspired or changed by someone else's authentic expression. When Owen kept his music quiet, he wasn't just hurting himself, he was depriving the world of something beautiful. Now, sitting in his studio, listening to Jordan play with growing confidence, Owen felt a sense of purpose deeper than anything he'd experienced in that corporate office. This was the work that mattered. Not just making music, but helping others find the courage to stop hiding, to let themselves be fully seen. His phone buzzed with a reminder. Concert, tonight at 8. 2 years ago, that notification would have filled him with terror. Now it filled him with excitement. He'd be standing on stage again, doing what he was meant to do, living the truth instead of running from it. Owen walked to his piano and played a few scales, warming up his fingers. The sound filled the studio, bright and clear and unashamed. No more covered pianos, no more hiding, just music, honest and true, the way it was always meant to be. And somewhere, he liked to think his grandmother was listening, smiling, knowing that the seed she'd planted all those years ago had finally broken through the soil and bloomed into something beautiful.